Welcome back to SuiteScript Stories. My name is Eric Grubaugh, and with me today is my comprehensive co-host, Tim Dietrich. How are you, Tim?
I'm good. I'm always waiting to see what adjective you use to describe me. And I never understand. I don't know if you just make it up at the last minute or I don't know. You lay awake at night trying
Sometimes.
to worrying about how am I going to introduce Tim tomorrow?
It's a random list of adjectives that
There
I
you
just pull
go.
from the top.
Yeah, I can't wait for the next one.
Today, we are here to talk about the difficulty of naming things in your SuiteScript, in your NetSuite customizations. Now, Tim, you had originally proposed this topic, so I think I'm going to kick it to you to bring us in.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is an episode that's been just a really long time coming. I went back and looked at my notes to try to see when I had first I don't know how, which one of us originally proposed it, but I know that I started doing research on it all the way back in December of 2020. So this goes way back. I think it was one of our first, when we had made a list of things we had planned to talk about, when we first started the podcast, this was on that list. So I'm glad we waited, and I'm glad that we are finally doing it. So I want to start with a quote that I came across a while ago. It's been around for a long time. It has to do with naming things, and it's by Phil Carlton. The quote is, I'm sure everybody's heard this before, but there are only two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. I think there's probably more than two, but it's a good quote. Again, it's an old quote. I saw it recently. I was looking at a blog post from Martin Fowler. He's got a blog post called Two Hard Things, and he references that quote. He also has some other sort of, interesting takes on that quote or similar quotes, and we'll link to that blog post in the show notes. But one of the ones that I came across in his blog post that I thought was also really good, one of my favorites, was it is by, I'm going to totally butcher his name, Matthias Verace, I think. His take on this, or his variation on it, is there are only two hard problems in distributed systems. Number two, exactly once in delivery. One, guaranteed order of messages, and two, exactly once delivery. So if you read it, it makes more sense than me saying it, but it's kind of funny.
Right.
So anyway, I thought that might be a good way to kind of kick this off. But I think the first thing that maybe we should chat about is what's the big deal? Why is naming things important? And
that's a really good place to start.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And then, we can sort of follow up on well, how do we use good names, come up with good names for things? So, why do you think this is important?
Oh boy. I think naming things it's a form of documentation, right? It's part of your documentation. It contributes to the readability, the maintainability of your code. It contributes to the cognitive load of working in your code. If things are named poorly, unclearly, inconsistently, it makes it harder to live and work in your code. Every time you get into that code, you'll be confused, you'll be stressed out, you'll just avoid it in the first place. Or, if you don't like thinking about your own code that way, think about reading someone else's code that way. It will add to that, increase that cognitive load and that anxiety of working in that code, and that will become the dark corner of the code that you don't want to touch anymore, that nobody wants to look at, that nobody wants to work on, that everybody's afraid to change. So it's part of your documentation and the developer experience of working in your code. And so naming things clearly, concisely, accurately, consistently will improve that experience, and thus improving the sort of the maintainability and the lifespan of your code.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there. I think, one of the reasons that this is so important is that if you have good guidelines, if you've got like, I don't want to say rules, but standards, even if they're your own standards around how you name things, then I think development
Mhm.
just becomes more efficient. Reading code in general, I think, is easier as well, like you said. Um, and I think, in theory, I think that when you're writing the code, if you do have a pretty good sense of like how to name things, we spend less time having to think about them, right? Like I think you should still stop and pause and think like, is this a good name for this variable or this function, this method, what have you?
Mhm.
So I think it speeds up development because of that, if you're the actual original developer of whatever it is. And I also think that when you're reading someone else's code, and I think this is kind of what you alluded to, it just like if the names sort of make sense to you, if you're understanding the names, then you're going to understand that code that maybe you didn't write, or maybe you did, and it's just been a while.
Mhm.
But it, just like you said, it's kind of like the comprehension of it, the getting familiar with it is that much easier. Whereas if the variable names are, they just don't make any sense to you, the code might be great. Uh, when I say great, I mean like what it's doing. But if the names are challenging, I don't know if you'd even be able to tell that the code was decent or not. So, and like you
Yeah,
said, I
it would
think
make it
that,
that much harder.
yeah. And I think like, you started off and I think this was my main thought too. Like naming things is almost like this sort of weird, it's like a form of like natural documentation. I think that if you're a developer and you've been around for a while, you almost take it for granted, right? Um,
Mhm.
so I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's extremely important. Um, and it's all too easy to take for granted. But when you do look at code that maybe you wrote it a while ago, or you're looking at somebody else's code and the names don't make sense to you, that's when you're like, maybe names are important after all. So,
Yeah.
yeah, right. The other thing I was going to say about this too is when I do look at code, if the names are kind of wacky, if they're if it's things are poorly named, um, that's like a first impression for me, right? And even if the names don't make sense, that's almost like I'm at that point I'm thinking like I've already got doubt in my mind as to the quality of the code. It's an easy early marker for like, is this code decent or not? That and the structure of
Yeah.
the code. There's a lot more to it than that. And then, we'll
It's a
talk
little
about
bit
this.
like reading a book with no punctuation.
Yeah.
You'd be like, this story might be amazing, but it's going to be really hard to slog through that if there's no punctuation or capitalization or something like
Mhm.
that. It's going to be really hard to get through it,
Yeah.
even if the story itself is amazing.
Yep. The other thing, and you mentioned this too, is consistency. And if I'm looking at code and the names seem inconsistent, when I say inconsistent, both in terms of like what you're trying to describe with a certain, like maybe you're like calling a value, one thing here and one thing there, and so on and so forth, or the styles changing or what have you. That inconsistency also, like if I see it, then I'm like, oh boy, again, like you really immediate. It's like the second impression, if you will.
Hmm.
It's like, and it's not a good one. So yeah,
Yeah.
those projects where the names are not well thought out and not consistent tend to be a nightmare. They also, I think, point that inconsistency sometimes points to a hint that there have been more than one developer in that code, and that inconsistency sort of, to me, makes me feel like there was no communication. We've talked about recently
Yeah.
about handing off code. That's like a marker too, or an indication that, uh-oh, and you can tell by the style, just things that are copy and pasted clearly from somewhere else. And, yeah. So,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. When
So,
there was some sort of transition or some sort of collaboration where, yeah, the communication broke down, and that will only add to confusion and inconsistencies, and again, increasing that cognitive load, decreasing the developer experience, just making it
Yeah.
code you want to avoid or code you want to, every time you get in there, you're like, I need to refactor this. And you might not need to, it might work fine. But if you feel like that every time you get into that code, you're going to do it. You're going to refactor it.
Yeah.
And that you may not have time for that in the project. And so just it like snowballs really quickly.
Yeah, I think if we have time, I'd like to talk more about that, because I think that if you inherit code and the names are poor, for lack of a better description, then, one of the things that I think we both agree on is it's all about consistency. So the question I have is, if you're the second developer in on this project, or third or fourth or fifth, whatever, just to be consistent, do you follow along with the poorly named variables? Like, at what point do you decide this is just too painful? It's time to refactor. And again, like, that's probably a bigger topic for this, but it's something to think about. Anyway, so we've talked about why naming, like, why the topic is important, but what do you think makes naming things so hard? Like, why are we even talking about this? Why isn't it easy?
For the same reason that good documentation is hard, for the same reason that all communication is hard. You don't necessarily know who your audience is when you are writing the code. Most of the time, we're writing it for us or our teammates. And so you don't always know. You don't know if you're going to transition it off, or it's going to get taken away or moved or scrapped or whatever. You don't know any of that ahead of time. So you don't know who your audience is. And so when you don't know that, you don't necessarily know their familiarity level. You don't know any of that. You don't have any context around who you're writing for. And so that makes it really hard to write anything, a story, a blog post, code. That makes it really hard to write anything. So, and no matter what, the person who reads your code is not you. They didn't write the code. They don't have all of the context, and they don't have the same perspective that you do. And so communicating your ideas clearly through code is just as hard as communicating your ideas in a blog post or in a book. We just do that in our code through the names that we use, through the styles that we use, through the patterns, conventions that we use. So that's what makes it hard. You don't know who you're writing for. You don't know how they might name those variables or functions. You don't know You don't know very much at all about who's reading your code. And most people probably aren't thinking a lot about the people who are going to read their code. They're thinking about writing the code, getting the task that's in front of them done. They're not thinking about that future state, or even if it's that tomorrow's code review state, not necessarily thinking about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think coming up with I'll put air quotes, like, a good name, I think, is pretty subjective, right? I think there's certain things that we can all agree on that make clearly these are bad names. But I think the fact that it is somewhat subjective, I think that alone makes this difficult, because, like you said,
highly subjective.
Yeah, what you think is, a good name, and what I think are a good name, that, it might be very different, and we could probably argue about, okay, well, here's why I think this is good and this one's bad. But that being said, I think that there are some common reasons that it's hard. I think sometimes we don't fully understand what it is that we're the code that we're trying to write, or the business or the process that we're writing the code to support. So sometimes you don't know what to call something, right? There's that. There may be terminology in that business or in that process that you're just not as familiar with as some other process. So, like, a good example is, I recently started working with a company that does work in the construction space, and they mentioned a term that they call retainage, which I honestly, I had never heard of that before. Apparently, it's very common in the industry. I didn't know what it means. If you don't know, when you're interested, look it up. I initially assumed that it had to do with retainers, and to some extent it does, but not like, if you're a consultant, it's not really the same idea.
Okay.
So, like that, I'm not deep enough into doing work for them yet where that's really come up and I've had to like name variables around it or write code around it yet. But I was
Okay.
like, oh, well, that's a new term to me, right? And
Yeah.
who knows how many other terms in the construction industry I'm not familiar with yet, but I'll probably learn them, right?
For sure.
Um, and similarly, like when I started to do a lot of work for companies in the manufacturing space, they've got their whole you need like a cheat sheet or like a manufacturing terminology Bible or something where it's like, hey, here's all the terms you need to know. So I think
Yeah,
that's a part of it, right? Like,
it is. This is actually something I have in my notes to talk about is domain specific languages. Um, and all of your clients, every industry, every vertical, every horizontal, they all have their own jargon
mhm.
and they all have their own domain specific language, and your code, your documentation, your code, your conversations, all of those should mirror that vocabulary. So things like glossaries are super helpful in this case. I worked with a client for a long time who they renamed the customer record to constituent, which is great. They call the people who give them money, they call them constituents. So I could have said, well, that's actually the customer record, and in my code, I'm going to call it, every time I reference that record, I'm going to call it the customer record because that's what it is. That would have been wildly confusing. They would have been talking about constituents. I would have had to translate that every time into customers. And the next person who touches that code maybe has no idea, what that we did that translation. So they're going to be very confused, looking for customer records, finding constituent records. Like your code should mirror that domain specific language as much as possible. And that's a concept that they talk about in the pragmatic programmer. It's like one of the first chapters of that book, which is, maybe the quintessential how to be a programmer book of our time at the moment. So that's where I heard this. You really want to adopt that sort of vocabulary, the same vocabulary that the people using your software, consuming your software, are using. Your software should mirror that as much as possible.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. I've actually seen code and had situations where I've had non-technical people, meaning they're not developers, um, look at code that they were able to understand because of the naming of things. Like it just,
Mm-hmm.
assuming, the code itself is pretty decent, if there are names that they're familiar with, then they'll be able to kind of scan through your code and be like, hey, you're doing this wrong. In other words, I think they're more likely to understand your code if they are familiar with the terms. They don't have to be another developer. And
Yeah.
sometimes their feedback is, pretty awesome because they get it, right? And they at least kind of get a sense. They might not understand the details of what you're doing in like a function or a method or what have you, but they're like, oh, this must be where he's calculating commissions, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully you've called that commission. Like the commission word is in there somewhere. Um, the other thing I wanted to point out though, like getting back to the domain specific terminology, one of the things I've seen that just blows my mind is how different domains will use the same name for something, but have very different meaning for it. Um, I've seen some very drastic examples of that. Even with like how the industry itself works and how products flow, within that industry. But one of them that comes to mind, and I'm running into this, as a matter of fact, I have a blog post I put out this week about upsells, which is, like it's kind of a marketing term. It has to do with, you know, if the customer has bought this or they're in the process of buying this, then you can suggest something else based on what other people who bought that thing in the past bought. And it's more to it than that. But my background in e-commerce, like an upsell was they're about to buy the lower price version of this thing, but here's a higher price version of it. Let's upsell them. And then there's cross-selling, there's all this other terminology, but it's just one example of where, you know, this is NetSuite itself that has their own definition, not their own, but the way they look at upsells and the way I think of it, I don't know, it's different. It's different enough that it caused me confusion. And so again, like all this just is like to get back to the fact that this is why naming things is hard. You know, we don't do it to intentionally confuse people. We don't deliberately like pick bad names for things, but it's easy to fall into that trap, right? Not even realize we're doing it until somebody someday says, you know, why do you call it that? You know,
yeah.
So anyway, are there other things you can think of about like why this is so hard? Or is that a good summary?
No, I think that's a good summary on why it's hard.
Yeah. I think for me, the biggest thing about all that is, again, that it's, you know, it's very subjective. Like that you want to pick a name that you hope will make sense to you and other people. And sometimes that's difficult. And because you don't know who you have to agree with, like, you know, who else is going to be reading your code.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
All right. So the next thing to move on to is like, okay, so we now know why naming things is hard, but well, what makes a good name? This is like opening Pandora's box, but
it is.
And again, like going back to what I said earlier, you know, that being subjective, be like what I think is a good name might not be what you think it is. So what's a good name? Let's try to agree.
You know it when you see it. It's one of those things. So there's not like, I don't think there's one, you know, there's not like one rule or formula that you can follow to make a good name, because it is subjective, and that's frustrating. But there are things you can do to make the naming of things within your project better. And so that's things like consistency and adopting conventions and patterns that you always follow, that you always name similar things to look similarly. Things like that will help reduce that cognitive load. Again, I'm going to talk about this a lot, but increase the developer experience of your code. If things are consistent, that goes a long way to making your names better. You always, if enumerations always look the same, you know very quickly they become very recognizable within your code. I do things like, I always name, if a function does a search or a query, I prefix the name with find whatever. So I know if a function name starts with find, it's doing a search, it's doing a query, it's going out and retrieving data from NetSuite. There's other patterns I can talk about like that, but I think that's the important thing, is sort of understanding and establishing conventions, documenting those conventions or communicating them to whoever you know is consuming your code, and following those conventions will make it will make naming things easier, or it will at least give you less decisions to make when naming something, and it will also help the understanding of someone reading. So that's the first thing. Adopt conventions.
Yeah. So similar to like this whole idea of, you know, good naming being subjective, the other thing I think is worth pointing out is that a good name in one programming language might not be such a good name in another. And I'll talk more about that later on, like it's such a challenge for me some days, you know, and I'm jumping between sometimes 4 and 5 different languages in the course of the same day. It's just crazy. And I'm like, you know, I'll be in PHP, but I'll be naming variables as if I'm in SuiteScript, like, and vice versa. There's underscores and things, and camel case, or just the names themselves are wacky.
Right.
But I agree with you. I do think there are some general, guidelines that can help, because otherwise this would be a very short episode and it'd just be like, okay, it's hard. We
Yeah.
don't know how to help you, but it's just good luck.
Just a commiseration episode.
Exactly. So, I did a lot of research on this. Obviously, I've had more than 3 years of like coming across things about naming, like different articles and blog posts and things on Hacker News and stuff. There are a couple of blog posts that were particularly helpful to me, and we'll again list them, I guess, in the show notes. But this is why I said at the top that I'm glad we waited so long to do this episode. But there's a book that I came across, and I'm not sure exactly when it came out, that I think is just an awesome resource about naming things, and it's called Naming Things. It's obvious, not surprisingly, I guess it has a great name. It's called Naming Things: The Hardest Problem in Software Engineering. Right. It's a book by Tom Benner, who's actually a software engineer at Airbnb. And had I had my wits about me, it would have been great to like reach out to him and see if we could have had him on as a guest, because after reading his book, I'm like, this is the guy. If you need to talk about how to get good at naming things, he's just got what I think is great advice. In the book, he lists what he describes as universal principles. There's 4 of them that are for naming things, and you've sort of alluded to a couple of them already. Understandability, meaning the name should invoke some understanding, or sort of naturally be like, oh, that's what this thing is. Conciseness, which is one that I've struggled with. Like sometimes you're trying to, like the name is like, I don't know, 64 characters long.
Yeah. There's a balance
ever,
to be struck there.
Definitely. Consistency and distinguishability, which I thought was interesting. And what we could do, if you want, is I can sort of run through what those are. He's got really, I think he describes what the principles are, and then for each one, he's got like some suggestions. He refers to them as rules, about like, okay, well, here's how to have an understandable name, how to make sure your name is concise. I can't speak enough about how awesome the book is. And what we could do is just put that as a link and then just call the episode done, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, he does just such a great job. Yeah, here you go. We told you what the problem is. No, but anyway, so with understandability, basically the way he describes it is that the name should describe the concept that it represents, right? Well, duh. But I think that is, it's easy to like kind of forget about that. That it should help you understand what it is you're describing, which is why we don't do things like, var x equals blah, blah, blah. Like, and he's actually got examples of where that kind of does make sense. Anyway, I could go through all the rules.
Makes sense. Like as an index of an iterator, everyone has agreed that that's okay.
Yep.
But almost anywhere else, one character is not going to suffice.
He actually brings that up.
Almost anywhere.
He even says, like if you go against that, sort of just, it's a given, right? If all of a sudden you're for I equals blah, 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 you put something else instead of that, now you're causing other grief, right? You're causing the developer to be like, what? I thought that was interesting. There are some rules that he has around understandability that I thought were particularly interesting with regard to what we do in NetSuite. Like, for example, one of his rules is include the units in measurements. Like, instead of elapsed time, put elapsed time in days or elapsed time in seconds. And I got to thinking about that one. And for those of us who, are developers in NetSuite, like there's this concept of, or field on like the transaction table where it's like the foreign total, I think is the actual name. and then there's a currency field. So it's split. And in NetSuite, that makes sense, right? Because it's possible that the currency of that transaction is different. So in some cases, it's a great rule. I think what he's trying to like suggest here, but in some cases it just doesn't make sense, right? So even these rules, I think, again, like I think it depends on the domain and the language. Sometimes they make sense, sometimes they don't, but it's all about being consistent. So
Right.
so
Yeah, I think that's where it gets tough, calling them rules rather than, I like conventions typically, because conventions, you feel more like you can deviate from a convention, but not a rule.
Yeah, you break a rule.
Okay. And then you're in trouble.
Or you maybe get in trouble. Yeah. Let's see. There were some other good ones in here. He mentions avoiding abbreviations, like, for example, AP for accounts payable. Okay. I kind of agree with that and kind of don't. It's like we deal with those, kinds of that kind of terminology quite a bit in NetSuite, depending on what you're doing. And then when you think about the conciseness, the goal of having concise names, if I spell out accounts payable everywhere, it's gonna get rough.
Yeah.
So I thought that one was really interesting.
That's where the context is important, though. Like in somewhere like you're writing accounting code for NetSuite, you're probably going to say accounts payable over and over and over and over. If you're not, if you're in a very different environment, I don't know if it's like an e-commerce site or an integration somewhere that talks about accounts payable once or twice, that's very different than I'm writing this accounts payable module.
Right. Yeah.
So context, like rules, conventions, whatever, are very important, but they can't stand in isolation of context. There is always context to apply to those things to make them more useful, and to know when you can deviate, adjust, or just break from the rule.
Right. Yeah. So with regards to names that are concise, again, he's got a bunch of rules here, but one of the ones that sort of rang a bell for me is omitting metadata. And so by that, he's talking about, like, if you name a variable first name str to indicate that it's a string, or first name int that it's an integer, or what have you. I see that a lot. I don't like it. Like I don't, and yet I say that, and there are other languages that I've used and use where it's common to do that. Like developers swear by it. Though sometimes they'll prefix the variable with like an I to indicate, oh, this is an integer.
Yep.
Like that's not the first thing I need to know about the variable. And if I really, I don't know, I could go off on a, get on a soapbox about all that, but that one got me. I'm like, yeah, I'm glad he agreed. Like, don't do that. But I'm curious about your thoughts on it.
I don't like it either. I think it is metadata about the variable. It doesn't tell us what the purpose of the variable is or what it represents. I think it's important to have that metadata, especially in a loosely typed language like JavaScript, where you can just, I declared it as a string, and then I made it a number, and then it was an object, and then it was an array. Don't do that. That's a different problem in a different episode. But that goes back to the consistency. But I do that. The variable name is not the place for that information, especially with modern IDEs and tooling. You can just add a comment with the type declaration above where you declare the variable. Give it a JSDoc type tag, say it's a string, and most IDEs can interpret that all on their own. So unless you're using BBEdit, like Tim is, I'm just kidding. I've never used BBEdit, so I don't know what its functionality is. But unless you're using Notepad to write your code, your IDE should be able to interpret, hey, that's a string. And if for some reason, and once you declare a variable, keep it the same type, even though JavaScript lets you change it. Fine. Don't, or if you do, document when, where, and why you're doing that. But probably if your variables are changing types, I know it's a different problem, but that's a code smell. That's something that needs to be investigated and refactored, probably a design problem.
Yeah.
Not hey, JavaScript lets me do this, so I'm just going to do it. No.
Yep. I run into that one a lot because, a lot of my work involves consuming APIs. And so I'll get the response in, and it's, typically a string, and it's typically like a JSON encoded value. So I bring it in, it's a string, and then I immediately convert it to JSON. And, I remember early on, like, struggling with, is this after I do the conversion, now it's essentially an object. Should I use the same name? Shouldn't I? And it's like, nope, don't, like. And so that's where I break my own rule of actually, like, in that case, I will actually, and I don't like it. I'm not quite sure. Maybe, again, like you said, it's a separate episode, but it's like, okay, what do I call the second version of that? Do I call the first one the string version of it? And, so, I guess hopefully, like, one of the takeaways from this is I hope that people realize that we all struggle with naming things, even after you've been doing this for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. In that particular case, I'm curious though, like, what would you do? How would you handle that? Where it's coming in one, it's coming in as a string, you're converting it to JSON. And I know I'm being very specific here, but what would you do? How would you name them?
Yeah, I think a similar example is if you're running a search in NetSuite, everything's a string. Everything comes back as a string, almost everything.
Yeah.
So what I do in those cases is generally, I'm not like, say whether it's coming in as a JSON object, I'm not pulling out each property and putting it into a variable that needs its own name. What I do, especially in integrations like that, and in searches, queries, almost always, I'm going to this external system, and in my code, I view NetSuite's database as an external system. I'm pulling in this data, and it might be in all kinds of formats. Whatever those developers decided the format is, that's what they decided. I need a layer to translate their data format into mine, into the data format for my system. So before I'm ever declaring it in a variable, I'm translating it to the format I want it to be in. So currency is coming over as a string and I need it to be a float. I'm going to do that as soon as I receive that. Before I ever try to work with it, do math with it, I want to make sure it's in the right format that my system needs and understands. And I do it so often that I have a name for those. Those are called parsers. And I always, in integration projects, I always have a parsing layer. And I always call them parsers. That's always in the module name. It's always in the function name. That's what it's doing. It's taking some external data format and turning it into my internal system format. It doesn't matter where it comes from, what format it came in, XML, JSON, string, number, whatever. I have a parsing layer that forces all incoming data into the right format for my system. And then I put it through my system to do whatever logic I need to do with that value.
Right.
And then I can give it a better name.
I think that's a great tip. And so for those of you who have followed Eric and the work he does in SuiteScript, there you go. I think, if we were charging for this episode, that little tidbit alone, you got your money's worth plus some.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll have to actually publish an example of that now. But
yeah, there you go.
That is what I do. I have parsing layer and a transforming layer in almost all my integrations, especially, but larger projects.
Very cool. Okay, so I could talk more about conciseness, but I think like some of those examples that we gave there are good. Consistency is one of the other principles that he talks about, how, names should be used and formatted uniformly. I think we've talked enough about that, but
I think one thing to maybe mention there real quick, sorry if I derail you, but what we haven't talked about is like maybe some of the tactics of doing that. Like the really obvious one for me is case.
Mm-hmm.
Like different cases in your names represent different things. So I know lots of teams who use the convention of like, if something is a constant that should never change, it's in all caps and the words are separated by underscores. Super common convention. I don't like it that much, especially if you're writing SuiteScript 2.1 and you're using const all the time with almost every variable declaration. But it's an example of a very clear indication. If you just look at that variable, you don't even have to read the name. You don't have to read the words. You know, okay, that's a fixed constant. I can't write to that variable.
Yeah.
So you can do things like that with not just the words and the letters that you're using, but just how the variable looks. So, and the case is a really good way to do that. Uppercase, proper case, camel case, snake case. Snake case would be a bad idea in JavaScript. No, snake case is good. Kebab case is bad. Dashes are bad. Hyphens are bad in JavaScript. But you can use those different cases to represent different things. So local variables for me are in camel case, whether they're consts or lets. They're camel case, the initial lower, but enumerations are proper case, or initial case, whatever you call it, where the first word is always capitalized, including the first one. So you can use cases and style like that to also impose, I guess, or show some metadata about the variable.
Yeah, I think the capitalization of constants is almost universal, in almost every language that I've seen. And then with SQL, uppercase is typically used to indicate that these are reserved words. And so if you look at like a lot of my queries, I try so desperately to always use uppercase around, again, the reserved words, functions, things like that. So I agree. There's some meaning that you can impart or imply just on that alone.
Yeah.
Again, that whole like, should you use camel case, proper names, different languages though, like they would laugh at you if like I shouldn't really say they'd laugh at you, but there are just standards with different languages, and that does make all this more difficult. So stick with JavaScript, like pick a language and stick with it. I wish I had done that early on, but no, I'm joking.
That's where context becomes important. And yes, there are sort of universal or very broad conventions, but those, you should still assess those with every team, especially that you work on, potentially every project. Assess those conventions and decide consciously whether you're going to adopt them, throw them out, adapt them. Every team should sort of decide on that themselves and should be documenting those decisions, training those decisions to new team members, and reinforcing those decisions in hopefully their code reviews and in any time they collaborate on code. All of that's very important and contributes to the consistency of the overall code base, not just like that script file or that project. And you can do that on your own too, even if you don't work on a team. You can do it on your own code, but consciously making those decisions of this convention, that convention, why you're using it, why you're not using it, how you changed it, etc.
Yeah, I do that a lot. I'm a solo developer, and so no, I'm not. It's very rare that I'm working on a team, but I do try to be consistent, not only when I'm working on the same project, but between projects. That's where jumping, between different languages throughout the course of the day or the week, it just, you gotta like put different hats on. Like, okay, now I'm a SQL developer, now I'm a JavaScript developer.
You're a polyglot.
Right. So I need semicolon at the end of all that crazy stuff. There were so with consistency, I don't want to go too deep into this, but there were some really interesting things that were brought up in the book that I thought
Okay.
were interesting. And these are like, sometimes I'll struggle with these. I'll even like sit there for way too long thinking about some of these, but like he's got some good ideas in here. For example, avoiding synonyms, like, like, are you going to use the word start or initialize? Like, if you use one, be consistent with it,
Yeah.
like that's one, which I thought was interesting. He mentions avoiding abbreviations, which goes back to the accounts payable thing that we talked about earlier. Like, do you put
Yeah.
AP or don't you? So I guess, yeah, if you can avoid them, but there are times where it's like, if it makes sense, just do it. Um, but this is the one that I think I struggle with. And again, I spend way too long thinking about it when I'm writing code. But you described it as use consistent antonyms. So I'll give you the examples that he gave. So the bad ones, if you use the word add, don't use uninstall, right? If you use the word install, don't use, remove. So the better way of doing this is if you're going to use the word add, use the word remove. If you're going to use install, use uninstall. I thought that was good because sometimes I'll tell you exactly where I do this a lot. It comes to like where I'm timing a process. And it'll be like, process begin, process end. Do I call it begin or end, start, stop?
Start,
I'll
stop.
mix them,
Yeah.
I do. I mix them
Don't
and
do
then I'll
that.
go back and I'm like, cursing myself. Because when I'm referring to them later on, I'm like, oh, that's right. I called it stop, not end,
Process
or
start, then end procedure.
yeah, it's like,
Don't do that.
right. So I thought that was a good one. And I like how he described it. And if nothing else, it made me feel like I'm not the only one who does this or has struggled with it or whatever. But anyway, I thought that was a really good one. Do you have any other tips around consistency?
Um, I actually haven't heard that one just mentioned, but I've never like consciously thought about it, but that is something that jumps out at me all the time. Like my eyes just like gravitate to that stuff, I guess. Yeah, like I said, if you start timer then timer end, like that jumps out at me, that the words aren't in the same order.
Right.
I don't know if that says more about how my brain works than it does about, being consistent, but other tips, let's see. I think that, like I said, there's conventions go a long way. There's lots of conventions you can have and how you name things. I think a lot of times we try to be too concise, and concise doesn't mean short. I think a lot of times we conflate those two terms. Concise doesn't mean short. It means understandable in the shortest space possible. So doing things like taking all the vowels out of your variable name, don't do that. That's a leftover from a decades old C where we were writing on microprocessors with a couple K of memory, or not even that, several bytes, like dozens of bytes of memory. You have plenty of memory to work with. Don't worry about the length. The problem where length comes in, I think these days, is too long, making your names way too long. If I have to scroll horizontally to read the name of your function, you did it wrong.
Yeah,
you
that
made me mad.
I'll raise my hand and admit to that one. It's like sometimes it's just hard, right?
It is, but it's just as hard to understand.
Yeah.
If you are scrolling through code that has these super long variable names everywhere, all the variable names are taking up half the page, you can't see the code. You're not reading the code. You're spending all your time just reading the names. Those names are equally as ununderstandable, as unintelligible as a very short name with all consonants.
Right.
So it's hard. It's subjective. That's why we're talking about this. But you can again come to these conventions either yourself or as a team, whatever it might be, to name things as clearly and concisely as possible. Like, it's a process. It's an iterative process of improvement. And if you want to know if your names are bad, have someone else look at your code.
Yeah.
Even if you don't have teammates, share your code with someone else. Just have them look at it. Like, get that feedback, especially if you are younger or junior developer. Get feedback from other people. If code reviews aren't part of your process, they should be. If they are part of your process, pay attention to the names of things and that consistency, and agree on the patterns and conventions that are appropriate for your team and your context. That's a really long tip.
I think it's a good one. I've got a similar one with regards to SuiteQL, Suite SQL general, but like in certain queries with the table, especially where you have multiple tables involved, which is common, you sometimes you almost always have to prefix the variables because there's a lot of overlap between column names in the different tables, like ID, a good example. So in SQL and SuiteQL, you can alias table names, column names, and so on. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good way to get them to be concise and a good way to get to kind of like you give them better names, I guess would be one way to put it. That all being said, I think you have to be careful going down that path, because you might end up aliasing something in a way that later on in the code, somebody's like, I don't know what that is in the transaction table, for example. And then you've got to go back and look at the query and figure that out. But learning how to alias and alias well is basically learning how to name things. You're renaming things. Sometimes Absolutely. It's necessary. Sometimes I think it's a good thing. Oftentimes, actually. I tend to do it more, and I'm also tending to do it more when it comes to some of these crazy table names that we're seeing, in the NetSuite schema. The names tend to get odd when they're like custom tables or custom lists and things like that. So where they're joined tables and the names just naturally get really long. We don't have any control of that, but we alias them. So I guess my tip is, if you're struggling with naming in your queries, look at using aliases. I think it's a good way to kind of wrangle code that we wouldn't otherwise be able to really even do anything about.
Yeah.
So the last principle that he has in the book is distinguishability. And I think this one's interesting too. It's the way he describes it is that a name should be visually and phonetically distinguishable from other names. And at first I thought, what's he really talking about here? And he's got very specific examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to cherry pick some of the ones that I thought were interesting. For example, he says, avoid homographs and near homographs. So I didn't know what a homograph was, but he explains it as they are two or more terms that have the same spelling but different meanings, so almost homonyms, if you will. The example he gave us the word check, which has multiple meanings. It could be like a verb. It could be a noun like, an inspection. It could be a bank check, right? Like, Now, with that one, I was like, well, again, I think it depends on the context. If I'm writing like a payable or a receivable type of solution, then the word check to me is going to mean like a bank check, right? Now, what I would try to avoid is like let's say a function where it's like check expiration, like, okay, I get that one. Like that's weird, maybe validate check expiration or whatever, but I thought that was an interesting one. He's got other ones in here. One of the ones that I came across in his examples that I thought really would resonate with us, especially, with doing SuiteScript work, is he said, avoid names with distinct technical and non-technical meanings. And the example he gave was class. So imagine that you're working on a NetSuite system for a college or some school, whatever. Naturally, the term class is going to come up in their terminology. And it's like, okay, so what do we do there? Is it, like, how do we handle that? Specifically with a class, the possible alternative is we'll call it course.
Mhm.
But again, like that. So it's easy to like have these rules, and I think we need to keep them in mind. Like you said, they're really more, this should probably be thought of more as suggestions or conventions, but I thought that one was like a good one. It's like, and I've run across that before. Sometimes I'll be writing a query and I'll naturally use a word that makes sense to me, and then I'll be like, oh crap, that's a reserved word. I think
Mhm.
catalog might be an example of one. I think that works or is a reserved word in PL SQL or Oracle SQL. But I've run into that in other database languages before. And your code is like throwing weird errors, and you're like, it's a big deal,
Yeah.
Like, so anyway, do you have any thoughts on any of that stuff, or if you run into those kinds of issues too?
Not specifically, I think, but we're getting back to like that domain specific language, and and we want to again adapt or adopt rather as closely as possible that domain specific language, but there's always contexts. If
Mhm.
that if their vocabulary conflicts with a reserved word, there's not much you can do about reserved words, right? Like you
Right.
can't just say nope, it's not reserved. Like we're going to agree that this word is not reserved. That's not how languages work. So
Mhm.
we have to come up with some other convention or pattern such that it does actually work and run in our code. It doesn't break our code, but still agree on that. I think one of the things I've been sort of circling around here is like good naming is not a task that you can check off. It's a habit. It's an
Mhm.
iterative, adaptive, evolving process that will change with every project you do, every team you work on, every client you work for. So it's not just something you can like learn and just check it off like, okay, I mastered this skill, I'm good at it, and I'm done and I don't ever have to try again. That's not how it works. You always have to be diligent about this, and the context will change with every single project and team and client again.
Yeah.
So, and that context changes the rules and the conventions that you can follow. So that's another reason it's very difficult. It is ever evolving and you will never be done.
Yeah. I think that's a good transition into like moving towards kind of wrapping up the episode. But I keep talking about this book, and there's a lot more to it than what I've referred to in the book. It's almost like this is a book review. It's an awesome book. If you are struggling with naming, or if you're just like, well, maybe I should look into this, definitely check the book out. He's got other information in there. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is one of his suggestions, or one of the things he talks about, is using style guides and using linters, which I think you're a big fan of. Am I
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
Do you want to talk any about that? Like, and with regards to naming, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, those are great tooling for conventions. I think and for enforcing your conventions. I think using supporting tools like that, and I imagine we'll see lots of AI tools around this too that help with this sort of thing, but linters and IDEs especially IDEs that employ linters are fantastic ways to establish some of these conventions, especially if you work on a team, because you can all be forced is not the word I want to say, but forced to follow the same conventions, or at least have to consciously circumvent them. Can't just arbitrarily and circumvent your agreed upon conventions without consciously doing something about it.
It goes back to that.
So
Are you following convention or not following it, or are you breaking a rule?
mhm.
Right. You had to go out of your way to
Yeah,
like to work around the linter and what it.
Exactly. Linters are great for that. Most of them you can specify a whole bunch of rules. There are a whole bunch of rules in the linter, usually what they're called. And you can say, ignore this rule, that rule is a warning, and these rules are errors. And so you can decide the sort of severity of breaking from those conventions or rules. Or whatever's appropriate for your team. So they are a fantastic tool. I use them even though I'm all by myself. I use the standard JS linter rule set so that I don't have to think about the rules. If you're not familiar with standard JS, it's a community driven JavaScript standard for ESLint, a linting tool. And I just chose to adopt it so that I don't have to like think about the rules. I've just signed on to agree to this set of rules, and that's what my code looks like. So it's not naming things for me, but it is telling me when certain style rules, when I've broken certain style rules or conventions that I agreed to uphold. And that's what a linter can do for any team. I'm not going to say standard JS is right for everybody. I'm not going to say ESLint is right for everybody, but I think some sort of linting tool and agreeing on some sort of standard or set of rules that your team agrees to is very important. It goes a long way in this sort of problem, helping you alleviate this sort of problem.
Awesome. One more thing that I want to bring up, and this is, I don't want to say it's NetSuite specific, but I run into it with NetSuite, and that is in naming things like custom record types, custom columns, and so on.
Yeah, the actual objects and the IDs and things like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the reason I bring that up is that I am particularly like careful when I'm coming up with those names, knowing that NetSuite's going to add something to like the IDs, for example, based on what it is you're naming. Is it a record? Is it an entity column? Whatever it is, custom column.
Yeah. There's
that. And then there's also just that pain of realizing later that you got it wrong. Going back and trying to change that, oh man, it can be painful in so many ways. The other thing is that there are limitations on some of the links, some of the names of different things in NetSuite, which makes me think back to the old days of certain databases where, you had 16 characters or whatever, 20 characters to work with. And you're like, okay, well, I guess I'm not putting underscores here. There's that.
Vowels.
If it doesn't tell you that you've reached the limit in NetSuite till you hit submit, and then you're like, you lose half of the context. This is probably an indication of a bigger problem, which is now you can see that Tim's got his, 100-character column name he's trying. But I wanted to bring that up. I'm not looking for like, if you have a tip to share, great. But it's like, that's one of those things where it's like, we're back to like naming things is hard. Sometimes in NetSuite, naming particular things is hard. It's tough. So anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. If you do, some magic, suggestion that will make my life easier from here on out.
No, I don't think there's a magic suggestion here. But again, there are conventions I follow with names, with IDs, so that I know very quickly what I'm looking at when I'm looking at an ID. That, I try not to use too many characters, but I run into the character limit too, especially on IDs. Not so much on names, but IDs, I hit that a lot, especially on script deployment IDs. But, in the past I've had like, I like to put, so for, let's say it's a script, I like to put the type of script in the ID. So I have abbreviations for all the types of scripts, and I have those documented in a table. I've seen other teams do this too. That's where I got it, was from another team doing this. I like to document the record type. It's like a user event that's deployed to a bunch of different records. I want to know in the deployment ID which record I'm working on. So I have abbreviations for all or most of the record types. It's a big table in a markdown file. And so doing things like that, adopting these conventions that, and they're all 2 characters. It's 2 character abbreviations for the script and for the record type. And coming up with 2 characters for like what's customer versus customer deposit versus, that's tough. But it's documented elsewhere. If I forget what one of my 2-letter codes is, I have a document that tells me what one of my 2-letter codes are. So again, we're just circling. I feel like I'm circling a lot, going back to conventions. But I think it's really important to have those. And we're limited to what, like 45 characters or something like that in the IDs. That's not a lot, especially if you are using underscores to break them up and stuff like that. You lose a lot of characters that way. So I try to convey as much information as possible, and I do that by being very consistent with these conventions that convey metadata in a short amount of space, as short as I can make it.
I think that's all great advice. This is why I always refer to you as the SuiteScript God. And I want to wrap this episode up by talking a little bit about something that you are doing. You've re-released the cookbook series that you put out a few years ago, the SuiteScript by Example, I think you're calling it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Just quickly, briefly.
Thanks for the unexpected plug. I did. So a long time ago, in the first iteration of my business, I wrote 8 different cookbooks. They are all example-driven SuiteScript books. So, each book focuses on a very specific like module or aspect of NetSuite development. So there's a book on the file module, and there's a book on the search module. There's 3 books on the search module because it's complicated. And they're all just example-driven explanations. So here's an example of a real world search that you would do. And here's a breakdown of line by line what it's doing and why it works that way. And here's a bunch of links to documentation or articles that will help you understand further. So yes, I have re-released all 8 of those. I have updated them to SuiteScript 2.1. I have added a little bit of clarity here and there. I have made sure all the links, I've added a whole bunch of links to, now that NetSuite's documentation is no longer behind a login, I've made all the links point to the public documentation, and I've been able to add more links to new pages because of that. What else have I done? A bunch of other updates. I've added chapters to some of the books, specifically the basic optimization book. Those, you can find out about those at SuiteScriptByExample.com.
Awesome. We'll put a link in the show notes to that. But I've got to ask, are you working on other books? Can we expect to see other ones?
I have a list of about 60 that I could do.
Yeah.
It kind of depends on if people find them helpful and useful, and if the community feels like they're a worthwhile effort, then I will absolutely continue. Each module, at the very least, I could do a book a module, and some of the modules, like the search module, the query module, the record module, all those could be many books.
Right.
But they're all short. They're all meant to be short, focused, 6 to 10 examples. Yeah, they're meant to be quick, digestible, practical examples that you can sort of play around with and tweak and experiment with to learn.
That's what I liked about the books. Like I've said before, that when I got started with NetSuite and SuiteScript development, it was your YouTube channel that originally was one of my go-to resources. And then I don't know when or how I discovered your I think you were calling them cookbooks or something at that time with the books. And I ended up buying them all, even if I didn't need like certain one for certain module. I'm like, I'm going to need that one day.
Yeah.
And what I love about the books is that they are concise and they're easy to read, and the examples aren't contrived. Like you said, they're practical examples. They seem like you lifted them out of your code, some project you were working on. You're like,
Yep.
I've got a perfect example of this. Here it is. So I can't recommend them highly enough. It's awesome. I'm so glad
That
you're
is
back and
exactly what I
doing
did.
that. Is it okay? Yeah, it seems
Yep.
like it.
I
So I
stole
know
them from real work.
I've said this in the past. I'm so glad that you're back and doing this kind of stuff in the community, not just the podcast, but seeing the books be re-released. And yeah, it's just great to have you back in the community in this role. I don't even know how to describe it, but to me, you always were. I will always be the SuiteScript god. So go get Eric's books. Is there anything else that we should chat about?
There is something I want to wrap up with, but first I do need to mention that this episode is sponsored by Salto. Salto is not a consulting company looking to sell you services. They are a software company that has built a DevOps platform to help you plan, review, deploy, and track your NetSuite customizations. And it can do the same thing with Jira, Salesforce, Zuora, and a bunch of other platforms as well. So if you want to check that out for yourself, you can try the Salto platform for free at salto.io. And you can also request a free demo from one of their experts. I just did one, actually. It was a lot of fun.
So you gave the demo.
I did.
Awesome.
I was there for NetSuite specific color commentary. I was not running the demo.
Okay.
We had an actual Salto expert do that, but I was there to say, like, here's where, they would show a feature and I'd say, here's where I've seen that useful. Here's how I see SuiteScript teams using that, or here's where I see this making your life in NetSuite a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
So I was there for the NetSuite specific context. I didn't drive the demo.
Yeah. Pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I kind of want to wrap up by saying that naming things, I mentioned this at the top or near the top, naming things is documentation. And documentation is not a task that you check off. Good documentation is a habit. It's not something that you do once. It's something that you cultivate over time. And you do it through collaboration, review, and continual improvement. So if you're just scattershot, naming things one at a time, or writing a document here and there, or sort of taking this hodgepodge approach, you'll never reach good documentation. You'll never reach good naming things. It comes from being intentional intentional and habitual, and continually wanting to improve. And that, especially if you're by yourself, that means getting other people to look at your code and tell you whether your names are good or not. That can only help you. You are not your code. So if someone comes in and says, these names are terrible, that's not a reflection of you. It's just, okay, I can improve the code. You are not your code. So don't feel bad about any criticism. Don't be afraid of any criticism. If you're afraid of showing your code to someone, don't be. You are not your code. A lot of times we wrap our identity. I think that's dangerous.
Yeah. I think that's actually a bigger topic too.
It is.
We've kind of hinted around about that in previous.
Add it to the list. You are not your code.
Yeah. That's a really good advice. Right.
So all that to say, curating your documentation and your names of things should be part of your daily workflow and your coding process. It shouldn't be something you tack on the end or think about between projects necessarily. It should be something you are continually reviewing and improving over time.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this was, I think, a fun and interesting episode. This is one that it's just the two of us. We don't have other people watching us as we're recording it live, so there's no questions.
No.
But it sounds like there's some really good potential blog posts for you to write. I've been kind of on a tear. But yeah, the one I think about parsing and that that layer that you add when you're bringing data in. It would be good. And I'd love to see more or learn more about some of the rules that you do have around naming, like that you're applying in the linter. You know, if you're willing to share those in a post sometime, I think that would be really interesting. There's another book
Yeah.
idea for you too. How to
Absolutely.
SuiteScript naming or something like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I didn't get too much into the tactics and like the specific rules that I follow today because the context is so important. And my rules aren't going to work in every context. So I didn't get too much into them today, but I would be happy to share them. I could write about them or maybe a future episode.
Yeah. Awesome. All right.
Well, you gave me a plug, Tim. Where can people find out about what you're doing?
You can just go to timdietrich.me.me. That's where I have information about what I do and my blog and all that good stuff. I'm sure we'll have links. We have links, I think, for both of our sites on the SuiteScript Stories website. So that's not really a show note so much, but yeah, that's where you can learn more about me. And I've been very active on LinkedIn. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, I do have one thing to share. I actually, after years, finally added an RSS feed to my blog. Yeah, that's one of my things I did on my holiday break.
Nice.
Yeah, so yeah, I wasn't working, but yeah.
I think I need to do something similar with my new site. I don't think I've got that up and running yet.
So my new issue now is that because of my site being so customized, it doesn't, there's no way for me to automatically generate the feed, which people will probably be like, what? But like, I have no way to do that. So now what I'm doing is like, when I add to my blog, I'll forget to put that in the feed. And then like, I'll go a couple of episodes and be like, wait a minute, it's been a while since I updated the feed. And it's not like I look at the feed myself, like for my own, like I know when I've posted, but anyway, you know, I'm goofy like that.
Usually.
Yeah, the only time I look at the feed is to make sure that I have not screwed that up. And that's a whole other topic. It's very similar to the feed for the SuiteScript Stories podcast. Like it's a manual process, which I know it shouldn't be, but it is. So
definitely check out Tim's site if you want to learn anything at all about SuiteQL, especially. You are still the SuiteQL guru for sure. It always will be in my eyes.
I've been writing so much about it lately because I'm working on a whole bunch of projects where the queries that I'm having to write for those projects are ones that are, you know, they're hitting either tables that I've never had to hit before, or they're, you know, they're intended to solve a problem that I've never had to solve before and haven't written about before. So like I mentioned the upsell article, I've got a similar one that I wrote recently about looking at RMAs, returns coming in from customers, and trying to identify what items are being returned the most often, that sort of thing. So yeah, so it's all interesting work that I'm doing. At least it's interesting to me, and I love to write about it. So that's where the inspiration for the blog comes from. I figure if I'm running into something weird, that maybe it'll help somebody else in the future. So
that is how mine started as well.
Cool. Well, should we wrap up?
Anything else, Tim?
No,
I think so. I think that is going to bring this episode of SuiteScript Stories to a close. If you'd like to get in touch with us about the show, you can email me, Eric, at stoic.software, or you can check out Tim's site, timdietrich.me. And we do hope you join us next time as we continue to highlight interesting stories from the SuiteScript world. See you then.